With around 50,000 rail workers going on strike from tomorrow, we're getting warnings this morning that strikes may cross over, to teachers, to healthcare staff and airline staff as well. But how realistic a prospect is a summer of discontent? Let's speak now to Mark Serwotka, the General Secretary of one of the UK's largest trade unions, the Public and Commercial Services Union. Hi, good to see you. Thanks for joining us. Summer of discontent. What do you think?
Well, I represent civil servants and we've taken a decision that we are balloting 150,000 civil servants for industrial action in September. I think the National Education Union are talking about balloting in the autumn as well. So I'm not sure about a summer of discontent. Clearly, we've got rail workers on strike this week. But what I am sure about is that we will see high levels of industrial action unless the government recognise that frontline public sector workers who kept the country running during the pandemic cannot be expected to have a 2% pay rise when inflation is forecast to be over 11%. That is a historic cut in living standards. People cannot afford it, and therefore the government needs to do something about it. If they don't, then I do believe we are in for quite a lot of industrial action.
The government and indeed the Governor of the Bank of England both saying that workers need to be realistic about what they're expecting. Otherwise, the inflation will continue to spiral.
Yes, I notice it's often rich people tell those who haven't got much that they've always got to be realistic. But what the government knows, if you take their own workforce, is we have had 11 years of pay cuts in real terms already. So on top of 11 years of pay cuts, when the average wage of the people I represent is a fraction under £24,000 a year, when tens of thousands of civil servants have to claim in-work benefits because their pay is already so low, saying be realistic just doesn't cut it, because it doesn't pay your fuel bill, it doesn't pay your council tax hike, it doesn't help you put food on the table. Only a real terms pay rise does that. And the government must know that, and the Governor of the Bank of England must know that. So they just need to accept that in this crisis, those people who've done so much to keep the country running deserve to have a decent pay rise, not take a further cut in their living standards.
Even if it fuels the spiral of inflation?
Well, we're often told it's wages fueling the spiral of inflation, but at the moment we know that's not the case. Wages have nothing to do with the current massive run on inflation. And of course, if we think about it, telling workers that they are the ones who can never have a pay rise really tells people that the only way we can fight inflation is that those who are suffering most must take more pain. And frankly, I saw your piece earlier on, Kay. It was a fantastic piece. If you are on benefits, or if you're on in-work benefits, or if you are struggling already to make ends meet, it cannot be right that a train worker or a job centre worker or a refuse collector already struggling, haven't had a holiday for years, worrying about paying the bills already, are told you must pay the price to keep inflation under control. It's just not acceptable. And I don't think people will accept it. And I believe most members of the public will support frontline public sector workers getting a decent pay rise.
But do you acknowledge what the Governor of the Bank of England is saying? Because presumably he's in that job because he knows what he's talking about. And unless we moderate our demands for a pay increase that is lower than inflation, it will just continue to spiral and make the problem worse.
Well, it's easy for the Governor of the Bank of England to say that, and I don't frankly accept that. I mean, inflation, they're forecasting probably over the next year or two will get back under control. But I think it's for the government to find out ways of trying to get inflation under control that doesn't mean the people paying that terrible price are teachers and nurses and job centre workers and the people who are already struggling. I mean, I'm often told by people, well, if you go on strike for more pay, it means the price of food goes up in the shops. But the reality is that the people we represent already are struggling to pay for the things in the shops. And if they get a pay rise, they can manage their household bills in the way that they choose. But it can't be right that the people with the least are always told that they have to pay the biggest price. That's not fair, and I don't think people will accept it.
Do you think the rail strikes will go ahead this week?
Well, I'm not in the RMT and I'm not on their negotiating team, but it seems to me all the mood music is that they will go ahead. And the thing that I would ask viewers to just take on board is I've heard Grant Shapps, who I think is a shocking Secretary of State for Transport. I've been unfortunate enough to have to deal with him over our dispute in the DVLA last year. He's a dreadful minister. But I think that most people will accept that disruption is not down to the fact that workers will now lose pay to withdraw their labour. It is down to the fact that the government is allowing the strike to go ahead instead of intervening to give job security for workers who worry about the future and give our rail workers a decent pay rise. And I, for one, would be happily to be inconvenienced if that inconvenience means that our frontline rail workers, men and women who do such a fantastic job and work so hard in the pandemic, that those people get a real living wage increase and they get job security.
Just before I let you go, we did have Simon Hart, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Simon Clarke, forgive me, on the programme earlier today, and I asked him whether rail workers have to suffer a cut in pay. He says we can't have inflation-busting pay increases. We tweeted that out. The RMT union has just retweeted that and said, unless, of course, it's for CEOs, because those private school fees won't pay themselves, he added, making light or certainly sneering at what the government minister had to say. Is that an approach that you would endorse?
Well, I think there's a lot of hypocrisy that is spoken by the government. And to be honest, when there's an onslaught demonising women and men, frontline workers struggling so hard, I think it's entirely reasonable that their union seeks to have their back. And of course, it is true that the people invariably telling those with the least to tighten their belts more are the ones who are incredibly rich. And we only have to look at our Chancellor, the richest man in Parliament, who is happy to tell people that they've got to tighten their belts, but he himself doesn't know what it's like to tighten his belt. So if unions are speaking it on behalf of their members, I back them and I back their dispute.
OK, good to talk to you. Thanks for joining us on the programme. Thank you.
Thank you.